Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 153, and we're going to talk about DEI and nepotism. But before we do, I just got to say, I saw that I got a thumbs down on a video. I mean, very few people actually watch or listen to this podcast, and so when I get a thumbs down, it's sort of like, oh. And if we were in class, I would know who was upset. I would reach out to that student. I would set up a meeting. We would have a talk. Sometimes I would have conversations that would go 2 hours, and mostly because the after the misunderstanding was cleared up, then we would have a really interesting conversation. But of course, on the podcast situation, you can't do that. I mean, I would conservatively estimate that about 80% of conversations that I had with students who seemed kind of upset ended very, very well. In fact, I had some students who were calling me a racist, and then after a short conversation, I became their favorite instructor of all time. It was kind of nuts that way. But even if a student didn't, like anything that I said, they would nevertheless be able to acknowledge that what I was presenting was in fact legitimate and had to be taken into consideration. Like no one is prohibiting anyone's opinion on anything. But at the same time, then you have to allow for other people to be able to believe what they want to believe. I understand that some topics are really touchy, but all of life is really, really subjectively speaking, extremely touchy. And speaking of touchy subjects, we're going to talk about DEI. And why is DEI in the news? Well, because Kamala Harris is basically being called a DEI hire, which, in Biden's defense, he did say that he was going to hire someone, appoint someone as VP who who could be identified as a Black woman, right? And we won't go into whether or not she actually is African American or not. That's for an entirely different episode. I have a lot of stuff to go through in this episode. I was able to write down a lot of it, but I wasn't able to record, and we had a family function today. I was out all day, and I just couldn't record until just now. So let's get to it. So DEI is a concept which relies heavily on racial categories or racializations. I've discussed this a lot in previous episodes, particularly in episode 8 with the old microphone. Maybe I'll redo it. But anyway, so DEI relies on an old, obsolete understanding of race, which is that race is a generalization based on a single identifiable characteristic. I think of a trait like a color, black, yellow, white, red, brown. I think of a trait, and then I fill that trait or that category with people who I would identify or associate with that trait. Now, that trait doesn't have to be visible, it can be something conceptual. And yes, it's not just restricted to people. If you can generalize it, then it's a racialization. Okay. We just only generally associate race with people, but you can categorize ideas, you can categorize sports, et cetera, et cetera. So you can pretty much racialize anything, that is, categorize anything. So diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI. That's what it stands for. So what does it mean? What do people say it means? Well, diversity, it's diversity of racial categories. So depending on the situation, it can mean color, gender, religion, age, etc. Equity, well, everyone has to be treated fairly, equally. And then finally, inclusion, that's of people who have been underrepresented, right? And so in any field, if the percentage of people in that field is below the population percentage, then that's underrepresentation. Okay. All right, let's break it down. And yes, I know some of you are falling over yourselves, but let's break it down systematically, academically, right? So diversity, as we increase the number of categories that we consider, right? Like LGBTQ plus, et cetera, and it keeps on going. They keep adding stuff. As you increase the categories, one will eventually get to the individual, right? Because then you'll realize that any individual will have an infinite number of categories that that person can be put into, right? I get into this a bit in episode 38 with intersectionality. Intersectionality, when I listened to a seminar on it by the person who did not renew my contract, he said that there were 13 categories. And, at the time I was like, all right, I'm not going to embarrass this person. I'm not going to ask him a question, but why only 13, right? Why those 13? Right. And so in my head, I was like, well, give it a few years. Maybe you'll get to where I am, where you realize that it's an infinite number of categories any person can have. This means that you can create diversity simply by highlighting different generalizations, right? Oh, athletes and geeks, right? So athletes, moms, dads, stepkids, adopted kids, immigrant kids, children of immigrant kids. You can create diversity by breaking people down by city of origin. So basically, at any given moment, every single school, every business is diverse, right? Because you just simply have to add in more categories or racializations, and bam, you have diversity, right? You see how that works? So hopefully that makes sense, right? So if you understand that diversity is created by simply invoking a different generalization, well, okay, fine, but every individual has an infinite number of racializations or categories or generalizations or racial groups that they can fit into. So even personally, me, what are a sampling of the categories I can be put into? Age, right? Old man, father, brother, uncle, son, brother-in-law, instructor, pastor, etc. I can go on. And so all of these different categories, right? It's a good thing, right? It means that diversity is always there. We're just not highlighted, right? The diversity that we have is not highlighted, and that's for political reasons. And I've gotten into that before. Equity. DEI is unfair. DEI is what is unfair, right? People are not judged fairly. That is to say, everyone is not judged by the same criteria, right? Some people are judged by their skill and their ability, their resume, others by a highlighted category. Oh, you're short. Oh, your gender is underrepresented. Your skin color, your education, whatever. So what you begin to realize is that it is worse than a double standard. It is arbitrary, right? So the criteria that you're going to use to judge other people is arbitrary, and it is always going to change. And so people talk equity, but it is fundamentally unfair. I mean, you begin to see this when feminists start running up against trans women, right? So who who is given more privilege? If you had to make a choice between the two, who do you go with? And you begin to realize that women now take a back seat to trans women, right? Stating the obvious here. And finally, inclusion. So the assumption is that we have to include people because historically, because of arbitrary discrimination, no one would hire them in certain businesses. So for example, for a very long time, there was an anti-Asian sentiment here in the United States. They weren't allowed citizenship. They weren't allowed to own property. They weren't allowed to have certain jobs, right? So underrepresentation. But we've discussed cost and price of discrimination in episode 10 and episode 35, okay? And what we realize is that every time you discriminate, there's a cost, right? So you're going to choose this as opposed to that. You're going to choose this person as opposed to that person. That discrimination, that choosing, that deciding that one is better than the other in this situation has a cost. Bad discrimination, which always happens, right? It happens all the time. But who pays for that bad discrimination? Like if you discriminated, using characteristics which really is not relevant to the job at hand, then there is a big cost. And so if you start, making choices based on arbitrary criteria, which has nothing to do with the job, then that business will suffer because they're paying too much for the mistakes of hiring, right? So if you are passing on really good workers, then that business who should be hiring the best of the best, they're going to suffer because those workers they passed on, well, they're going to find another job, either with another company or they'll start their own company. Right? If they don't get their job, though, you have to take into consideration maybe it's because they're not that good. And so they have to find another job in another field. Okay. So, for example, to illustrate this really easily, if we have inclusion in track and field, right? So let's go to the 100-meter dash. Okay. Where are the Asians in that 100-meter dash, right? 100-meter race. Okay. We should have DEI in track and field. No, right? Because in certain areas of life, they are not going to invoke DEI. What they're going to do is they're going to focus on only their skill, right? And so that's how you have sort of the best, right? Because you're focusing on the traits that are relevant to the task at hand, all right? I have lots of other examples, but I'm afraid of running out of time. So we're just going to move on. Hopefully, you guys understand this inclusion thing, right? What you're going to do is you're going to ignore that cost of bad discrimination. You're going to hire people who probably are not qualified, and therefore you're going to have trouble. Now, sometimes, right, because of DEI, you're forced to look at certain people and they are, in fact, qualified. But the problem is in the climate of DEI, everyone's going to think, well, this person clearly is not qualified. They only got the job because of their skin color, because of their gender, because of their sexuality, whatever. Right. And so that's a cost too, a cost basically, that is incurred when you have to have lunch with your coworkers, for example. So if a person really is good, then they will excel, they will succeed, and the company will do to do well too. So we need to have more freedom for people to be punished for bad discrimination, but rewarded for good discrimination, you see. So basketball teams that choose the best generally become the best, right? And keep in mind that choosing the best is not just the players, but it's the coaches as well. Okay. So there are lots of different factors, but that's the general idea, right? You want people to pick based on traits or qualities that are relevant for the task at hand. If it's going to be a sport, then you need people who not only have skill, but understand the game, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're only going to choose based on gender, say, for example, then your business is going to suffer a lot. All right, I'll give you one example. So let's just say, all things being equal, right, total freedom, a company is only willing to hire a woman at $5 an hour, right? Because of, lots of reasons, okay? But let's just say, it's a free society, no one can complain. And so women, they're going to be paid $5 an hour, and men, well, see, they want to be paid $10 an hour, right? If you're going to hire me, you got to pay me $10 an hour. Okay, fine. So one company says, okay, I'm only going to hire men because I'm sexist, right? And the other company, they say, well, I'm going to hire anyone. I just want to make a lot of money. Well, the business A that only hires men, they can only hire 10 guys, and that's $100 an hour. But company B, they don't care. They get to hire 20 women and pay them $5 an hour. Over time, you will see that business A either goes bankrupt or they only hire women as well. Men get squeezed out of certain jobs because, it doesn't require a man to do that job, and you can hire many more women to do that. You might scoff at that idea, but you got to understand that immigrants all throughout history, this is how they are able to, quote unquote, take jobs from other workers. They underbid them. They are going to ask for less money, right? Which doesn't work out if the job they perform is not up to snuff. Okay. And so there's a balance that you have to reach there. But being paid less does not mean that you are going to necessarily mean that you're being punished. Okay. It only makes sense to the greedy business to hire more people to whom you can give less money. Okay. All right. So hopefully that explanation clears it up, makes it a little bit more clear what I'm trying to say. So let's turn to nepotism. Nepotism. Well, that's favoritism on the basis of family relationship. And it can happen anywhere in business and politics, in the church. Okay, and we'll get to that in a moment. So it's the same situation, right? You are choosing by prioritizing the generalization or the racialization of family. It doesn't matter their quality, their ability, whatever, you're just going to choose your family over anybody else. Now, there are lots of reasons for doing this, okay? Not just simply, oh, they're corrupt. Now, sometimes, like when a plumber wants to give their son the business, sometimes it really doesn't matter that much because the skill set that is needed and required to run a business, like a plumbing business, is not as demanding as, like, say, President of the United States or King of the United States. Let's just say we had a monarchy, right? And so sometimes, the challenge or the situation where nepotism seems to crop up, it doesn't really seem to matter a whole lot. Obviously, the son, if or the child is not, or the relative is not on point, well, then obviously the business goes under. In the same way, if the king appoints his son, the prince, or his daughter, the princess, to be the next ruler, but they never paid attention in monarchy school, right? And so, they screw up the country, right? So that example of nepotism is generally what people think of when they talk about nepotism. Also, nepotism is raised when they see that a big CEO of a big, huge company, and he leaves it to his child, whoever that might be. And people will say, oh, that's nepotism. Well, sure, but who cares, right? Why does it matter to you? Now, it bothers some people only because they assume that that business will continue to be successful. But understand that if the CEO that passed away or gave it to their child, right, if they made a bad choice, if they discriminated badly, that person does not have the skill set required to be able to run a Fortune 500 company, then that business is going to tank. And so you, as the public or competitor, you rejoice. This is a good thing, right? That their discrimination is bad. Now, the thing is, we want, we strongly desire nepotistic type practices when it makes sense. Like farmers, you want someone who grew up on a farm to be able to take over the farm simply because farming is hard work, right? And if you weren't born into it, it's something very, very hard to learn. And when you learn it from a very young age, then you're hands-on, right? You understand the daily grind, the schedule that needs to be followed. And someone who grew up in the city, yeah, that's not necessarily going to be something that they understand. What about preacher? My church, just full disclosure, my father started the church, right? And then I was installed after him. And so whispers of nepotism were, abounded. And so obviously, if he chose badly, if he discriminated badly, then I could bankrupt the church overnight, right? Because of poor planning, lack of foresight, bad teaching, bad preaching, whatever, right? There are many ways to screw up a church, right? But if from a very young age, the preacher taught his child and the child saw all the, seedy, corrupt stuff that can happen, all of the nonsense that could happen, and you say, oh, yeah, these are the things that we should avoid if you want to do it right. So it's kind of like farming, right? You see the grind, you're not surprised, you're not disheartened, you're not, going to lose heart, whatever, lose your faith, in fact, right? And I know for a fact that if other people came in, our church would be bankrupted immediately because, number one, they would ask to be paid a whole lot more. And I'm being paid probably less than a part-time worker at most churches today. But, I still do everything that is required of me by this church, right? So the first thing someone else would come in, they'd demand, like, I don't know, 3, 4 times more money. right? And automatically, just by that request, our churches bust, right? So DEI in general is a bad idea, like for the military, as I discussed in episode 38. But sometimes the best candidate looks like a DEI or nepotistic hire. But what business is it of yours? If they did it badly, then the business will fail. The church will fail. The school will fail, whatever. So that's okay. We should not care about that. But here's the thing, positions like government, no, you can't do that. Monopolies, no, you can't have that kind of DEI or nepotism there. And the reason is because there is no punishment, right? So politicians who make really bad critical errors, they never pay. The punishment doesn't come out of their pocket, right? The economic downturn doesn't come out of their pocket. No. In fact, they just get to retire and have Secret Service protection for the rest of their life. That's no. That's why you can't have DEI or nepotism in government, because they are not liable for the harm that they cause. Second, monopolies can't, because there's no competition, right? And so you do it badly, no one can tell because there's no competition. There is no other company that can start, do a better job, and therefore put you out of business, right? And so in certain situations, I'll just off the top of the head, government monopolies or government monopolies and government protected monopolies, these situations you can't have DEI or nepotism. And because when you're wrong, the people who have to pay are the wrong people. The people who have to be held responsible, in other words, the people who go bankrupt, are the wrong people, right? So it's the taxpayer who constantly has to bail out government, has to bail out businesses, big businesses, particularly banks, right? And that is why you can't have that kind of arbitrary discrimination, ever-changing discrimination within those entities for which there is no competition. Okay, hopefully that helps a little bit, to realize just how bad our situation is here in this country, and perhaps how we can control and direct our sort of our activism, perhaps, or our activity against it in a more just kind of way. Anyway, that was a lot for a very short episode, but hopefully you were able to catch all of that. I will talk to you next time.